everyone. We're having some technical difficulties. Being this is the first time we are here, we are working on that. So again, I apologize if we're having these difficulties. We're also trying to figure out where, oh, there's our speaker, but I need to go bring in our students and our introduction. So if you'll just give me a hot second. So one moment, if you don't mind. We are trying to work through our technical difficulties as this is our first time having this Zoom meeting.
If I might chime in here, good evening, Dr. Van Kempen.
Yes,
Thank you. And it's indeed dark over here.
Okay. Yeah,
Well, good.
probably cold, a little colder than it is here too.
Yeah, it's well, actually today is not too bad, but this weekend they expect a serious frost. But
well, we got off to a frosty start, I think, this morning, but I think we'll be 50 or so. I think, isn't that we're slated for 50 or so today?
Yeah, that's a lot warmer than here.
Theo, I just made you co-host, so if you want to practice your slides, sharing.
Let me see if this is working.
Thank you again to those of you who are joining us. We're working through some technical difficulties. If you'll just give us one moment while the rest of our group joins us.
You now can see my slides,
Yes, we sure can.
and you can see my cursor.
Yes, we can.
All right, perfect. Then I'm all set.
All right, so Ben just joined us, and so I want to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Susie Goodell. I am the Director of Graduate Programs for the Interdepartmental Nutrition Program at NC State University, and this is our very first webinar in this new series that we're creating. We're trying to, in fall and spring semesters, have the webinar to where anyone around the world can join us. And I am also, when our students are available, I'm asking students in seminar to host our speakers. So this will hopefully be the only time you hear from me. And today we have Ben Harmon is going to be introducing and hosting this seminar. Take it away, Ben.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Goodell, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the NC State Nutrition webinar series, the first one in the series this semester. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest for today's presentation on nutritional strategies for preventing metabolic complications during COVID-19 infection. So Theo Van Kempen grew up at an innovative swine and poultry farm in the south of the Netherlands, which led him to the Agricultural University Wageningen and subsequently to the University of Illinois, where in 1993 he obtained a PhD in nutrition for his work on improving survival of neonatal piglets. Upon graduating, he worked in product registration research and development of quality control techniques for feed manufacturing. Then in 1998, he returned to academia and became associate professor here at NC State University in the field of swine nutrition with a focus on sustainability. In 2004, Dr. Van Kempen went back into industry with responsibility for novel product development across farm animal species for Nutritional. He also maintains an adjunct professor position at NC State. But before I turn it over to Dr. Van Kempen for this talk, please bear in mind that we will have time for a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So if you have any questions during the talk, please type them into the chat and we'll be able to address them during the Q&A time at the end in the order that we receive them. So now, everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Van Kempen.
Thank you. And actually, I didn't say it in the introduction, but my advisor for my PhD was Jack Odell. So a fantastic advisor, as all of you know. You're probably wondering, and by the way, if you cannot understand me properly, please interrupt me because I cannot hear from your side, of course. Why, as a swine nutritionist, I'm talking about COVID. And actually, the story behind this is that I've done quite a lot of work on phosphorus metabolism, and that's the topic of the presentation over the years. And actually, that has led to a paper several years back with Dr. Elizabeth Dijkstra. And when the COVID crisis hit Europe and the world early last year, she contacted me and said, "Hey, Theo, have you considered the similarities between what we wrote in that last paper and what is happening now in COVID?" And this basically led to a discussion where we were swapping papers and ideas and building a story, basically. And then one day there was a letter to the editor, actually, in American Journal of Physiology dealing with vitamin D and COVID. And we felt that was not providing enough information about what was happening behind that with the minerals that are steered by vitamin D. So we wrote a letter to the editor in response to that. And when we did, actually, we got the feedback from, no, you should resubmit this as a perspectives letter, which was a little bit scary because perspectives letter mean that we're supposed to be serious experts in this field, which you can argue about. But nevertheless, we did that. In the meantime, the paper has been accepted and published, and we're actually getting a lot of downloads, etc. So quite proud of what we achieved. In this process, by the way, we actually started off early on to contact researchers, hospitals around the world, literally, and ask them, can you please take blood samples from COVID patients and measure magnesium and phosphate? And very frustrating, frankly, is that in the lion's share, we got no response whatsoever. And I understand that people are busy and so on, but we got a couple positive replies, even a couple enthusiastic replies, but in the end, we got zero data. And that's something in this presentation you're going to see. And on one hand, it's a bit shameful that I'm giving a presentation where I'm talking about correlations and not causation. Although in the end, I have some real data to cheer you up, hopefully. But unfortunately, that's the state of science that we're in. And also, given that we don't have access to patients, that's the best we can do. Elizabeth Dijkstra is a very interesting lady. I've actually never met her, but we've exchanged a lot of emails over the years. Medical professional that has retired in the meantime with an amazing knowledge about biology, about medicine. So it's very nice to be working with her and to have a publication with her. She is a bit timid, by the way, so she wanted me to be first offer on the paper, but probably she's the one that really deserves it. One issue with COVID, and that's actually the same as with nutrition, is everybody has an opinion. And everybody has experienced, their mother, their uncle, their whatever, has all kinds of stories. And so it is very hard to have your voice heard. And in this situation, I mentioned all the hospitals that we contacted and so on. I understand that people don't listen because they're bombarded with people like us asking questions. So how do you filter that? Nevertheless, it's a bit frustrating, of course, that you're trying to make an impact without doing so. As I mentioned before, our story started with vitamin D. And actually, early on in the COVID outbreak, vitamin D started to get some attention. There were some suggestions made that it may well be playing a role. And actually, while we were communicating, there was the first actual data that came out. And this is Kaufman down here is actually one of the first papers that really described a relationship. At the y-axis here is the SARS-CoV-2 positive rate. At the x-axis is the 25-hydroxy-D3 concentration in the blood. And you see a very, very nice correlation between the two of them. And then again, correlation, causation, we can argue about that. Kaufman actually claims an R-square value of 0.96. Which I don't understand. I'm really sorry, but it's a different discussion. I mean, the repeatability of the vitamin D assay is not 0.96. How can you get that kind of correlation? But he probably played with the statistics in a creative way. But there's plenty of other data sets to consider. I just put a random one up here where they've looked at mild COVID versus severe COVID And in green are people that are adequate in vitamin D, in red people that are deficient in vitamin D, and you can clearly see the shift between the two categories. So that vitamin D has a role in COVID by now is pretty much established. Also, I checked a couple months back, I haven't done that very recently, but there's actually 70 clinical trials in progress at that moment to further define this relationship. The interesting part, or the scary part, is, and that's why I pulled this picture in. And by the way, I tried to cheer up my presentation by pulling pictures left and right for the internet, and they may not always be the perfect picture, but again, we don't have our own data, so it's the best I can do. But if you read the papers on explaining the role of vitamin D, they focus effectively 100% on the immunity role of vitamin D. You see here all kinds of cytokines and other factors that are being listed, but the role on mineral metabolism is completely ignored. And that's what bothered us. If you look at the COVID infection, and I won't go into in a lot of details here, but the virus is incorporated in the cell, it gets replicated, and then ultimately the cell bursts open. And the virus is released. Well, in that process, there are cytokines being released. You see here interleukin-1, several other factors that are being released. There's pyroptosis that is happening. And this is actually where the problem really starts with COVID. And I'll flip to the next slide here, because actually in COVID, there's an overreaction of the immune system. And this picture illustrates that quite nicely. You see all these little dots, that is all the cytokines being released by the system. They lead to the recruitment of macrophages, T cells, monocytes. They turn them into action. And actually there's an over response of the immune system to the COVID infection, doing a lot of damage. And this picture here on the left is actually the front page of Science from a couple of months back, dealing with COVID. And it says a rampage through the body. The lungs are ground zero, but COVID-19 also tears to organ systems from brain to blood vessels. And that's very interesting. And actually this picture explains it in a little bit better. It's actually these cytokines that are doing a lot of damage to tissues where the COVID itself really isn't present in an important way. The kidney is a very nice example. You see a lot of patients with kidney damage in COVID, even though the virus is barely present there. It doesn't seem to be the big factor. And that's the immune response that is really doing the trick. And that's also why people are dying with all kinds of strange symptoms that you would not directly associate with the COVID infection itself. Okay. Well, one reason for that is this cytokine storm, this overreaction from the immune system. But then the question is, why is this going wrong in these people? What is happening? And by the way, this is actually from a scientific publication, this artistic drawing. I was quite surprised to find that. And it's also from 2012. So the cytokine storm is a phenomenon that already is known for many years. But what in our eyes people were ignoring in this whole COVID infection, the cytokine storm, is that to drive this exaggerated immune response, you need ATP, you need energy in the system. And actually a couple of research groups have come up with the same hypothesis. This is a paper from Tagizade Hazari. She talks about the powerful immune system against COVID, a hypothesis. And her hypothesis says that the immune system is depleting ATP, and therefore the system is coming to a grinding halt. If we were able to replenish ATP in the cells, then actually we could solve some of this overreaction, this damage that is done by the immune system. Kupa-Hay, pretty much the same story, a molecular story of COVID-19. He talks about NAD depletion. Well, NAD and ATP are darn close together. And actually in his paper, he also mentioned ATP, but he links the symptoms more to NAD. But again, same thing. There's an energy problem in these patients that is responsible for a lot of the damage that is going on in the subject. If I say animal, by the way, that's because that's what I do the rest of the day. So I may mix them up once in a while. Well, an interesting question is, why would ATP be depleted? And I pulled a random picture of the internet to try to camouflage the person a little bit because I'm probably not doing this right, but the typical COVID patient is obese. So fuel supply is not the issue. Well, then the next logical answer is oxygen supply. And we all know the stories, especially early next year when the COVID first hit, that the hospitals were searching for respiration equipment left and right, turning CPAPs, apnea apparatus and so on into breathing apparatus. So oxygen supply definitely is a challenge in these people. But our question was, are there other nutrients involved in energy metabolism that could be short, causing these problems? And actually this paper I just found this weekend, 2021 publication, it's an interesting one, because what they did here is they isolated mitochondria from healthy control people COVID patients and people with a chest infection, and they measured the oxygen consumption rate of these mitochondria. If Shilin is in the room, this is the stuff he does every single day, so he knows much more about that than I do. But oxygen consumption is basically ATP production in mitochondria. And you see that this is seriously impaired in the COVID patients compared to people with a regular chest infection or healthy controls. Well, when you do this in vitro, oxygen supply is not the limiting factor because it's an in vitro system. You have taken the mitochondria out of the body into a petri dish and you're studying it. So then the question is, what is the rate limiting factor? And this brings me back to the ATP molecule, and nothing surprising to here, but the ATP molecule contains a lot of phosphate, and that phosphate actually is stabilized by magnesium. So the moment that you have an ATP storm in the body, you also need to pull a lot of phosphate and magnesium into the system in order to make this work. And actually a couple of people already brought this to the attention, although they don't go into this story. They have a different version of why phosphate and magnesium are important. Sears had a quite superficial letter to the editor saying that we needed to think about phosphate in COVID because it may well be problematic. And Wallace talked about magnesium being an issue. But again, the picture is not very complete, which they presented. So that's basically what we were building on. Well, one thing when the body gets deficient of phosphate and magnesium, there can actually be a sacrificial process where actually tissue is being sacrificed, literally cells lyse in order to release phosphate and magnesium, and the immune system actually plays a big role in that. One example of that is rhabdomyolysis, where actually muscle tissue is being broken apart in order to release phosphate. The bad thing is when this happens is you're not only releasing the phosphate and magnesium in the circulation, but you're also releasing myoglobin in the circulation. And that myoglobin gets caught in the kidneys and does a lot of damage in the kidneys. And actually when this process happens, a lot of these patients die because of kidney failure. Rhabdomyolysis has not gotten a lot of attention in COVID, so we don't know how critical it is. Question is, did people not look or did people not see it? And that we don't know. There's certainly reports of it and actually more coming out every single day. These are some publications that I pulled up last weekend for building this presentation, but there's certainly talk of it happening in various places. Another thing to keep in mind is that rhabdomyolysis itself, because the cell content is released into the circulation, that cell content contains a lot of stuff that actually triggers an immune response, can actually trigger a cytokine storm. So we also shouldn't forget that. When the kidney gets damaged, and we see this quite common in COVID, there's a lot of reports that people suffer very serious kidney damage and actually sometimes permanent damage where people recover from COVID, but subsequently have one kidney that is not working. The kidney damage that occurs in a COVID infection actually happens very much in the proximal tubular range of the kidney. And this is exactly the region where phosphate and magnesium are reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. That's why phosphaturia is listed here as a consequence of this kidney damage. This graph, by the way, illustrates the mortality of a kidney damaged COVID patient versus a non-damaged. So it's a very serious complications in hospital. And again, the press is all over this. Another reason why phosphorus may well be at short supply, and this is actually a data set from malaria, is that fever actually induces loss of phosphorus in the urine. In this picture here from Haber, looking at body temperature versus phosphorus content, you see that here is, and he didn't draw a line to it, unfortunately, but there's a nice negative correlation between the two. I put this red line in here just for illustrative purposes, and that value, please keep that in the back of your mind. 1.1 millimole is about the lower threshold for an adult where phosphate should be. So this shows nicely that if your body temperature gets high enough, we all become hypophosphatemic. So that's a serious complication. Gunther Pali studied this. He was actually focused on cancer. It's a relatively old paper. And what he was doing is he was putting people in water baths at 41 degrees Celsius for either 2 hours or 4 hours. And then he was measuring what was happening to phosphate under those conditions. He was trying to kill cancer, by the way, with this process. But what is very interesting is if you look at these data, and I've expressed everything on a relative scale to pre-heat treatment, you see that the renal threshold for phosphate drops tremendously and comes actually close to zero here. And as a consequence, the renal clearance of phosphate goes up quite drastically. And no surprise, the phosphate levels in the blood actually drop down very drastically. As a consequence. And again, these people here are severely deficient of phosphate. So that's definitely a complicating factor that we need to keep in mind. Why don't hospitals look at phosphate and magnesium? Well, this is my own term, but I'm calling them clinical orphans. And actually, it's funny, I had to go to the emergency room during the COVID crisis. My wife had a little accident, so I talked to the doctor, but I've had discussions with doctors on various occasions. Doctors in hospitals, generalizing, don't think about magnesium and phosphate. If you ask them to measure it, kind of go from, why would I bother? Even though it's just a simple cross mark on a form. I don't know why that is, but my speculation is, especially for phosphate, is when you have a severe phosphate deficiency, you're going to die. But how you die is very unpredictable. It can be the liver, it can be the kidney, it can be the heart, it can be the brain. Something will go wrong, but what goes wrong first, we don't really know. And I'm speculating that that's why people don't pay attention to it. Another reason may well be, and these are some data from my own work looking at magnesium in the blood versus magnesium in ham tissue of pigs, or phosphate in the jugular and the ham. The correlation between these two is terrible, actually. For magnesium, it's statistically significant, but this is certainly not a pretty picture if you ever wanted to publish it. And for phosphate, p-value 0.8, there is no correlation there. So if you really want to get a handle on what is happening with those two minerals in the body, you have to not only sample the blood, but you also have to sample tissues. And again, when you have a COVID patient laying there with all kinds of complications, to stick yet another needle somewhere in a tissue to get a sample is a complication that a lot of hospitals are not willing to go for. So what happens when magnesium and phosphate becomes deficient? And actually, there's a nice illustration here. Obviously, a lot of things shut down in the cells, but actually what is most critical short term is that we have these ion channels on the cell membrane, calcium ATPase, sodium potassium ATPase. They actually are the first ones pretty much to shut down. Well, with sodium potassium ATPase, sodium gets into the cell, potassium goes out. That causes edema, which actually is observed quite a lot in COVID patients. It's not reported a whole bunch because they have bigger issues to deal with, but edema is definitely a complication there. The calcium one, however, is the bad one. When calcium comes in the cell uncontrolled, it stimulates all kinds of proteases that actually start to break down the cell from the inside out. So the cell dies of necrosis rather than apoptosis. The contents of the cell spill out, cause an immune trigger, and actually cause a lot of damage as a consequence. Okay. Another effect of hypophosphatemia has to do with oxygenation of the blood. This is a picture here of hemoglobin. You have the 4 subunits, iron in the middle, oxygen bound nicely to it. Actually, for hemoglobin to lose the oxygen or release the oxygen into the environment, what it needs to do is it has to have a conformational change. Actually, they need to twist slightly upon each other, and then the oxygen can be released. The molecule that can induce this twist and conformation is 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate, glycerol with 2 phosphates attached to it. So basically what is happening in the bloodstream is this bisphosphoglycerate is continuously made or released in order to make the red blood cells release oxygen to the tissues. This equation here is actually a very famous one if you go into respiration. It's the Bohr equation. At the x-axis is the PO2, which is the amount of oxygen that is available for the tissue to absorb. Okay, and at the y-axis is the SO2. That's the saturation of the hemoglobin with oxygen. So when this is 1, then every hemoglobin molecule will have an oxygen attached to it. And when it's 0, there's no oxygen attached to it as well anymore. The pink line is in the presence of this 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate, and the black line is in the absence of that. And you see there's a very nice shift, and the shift may not look too drastic, but actually you got to look at it vertical. And then you see that there's a very strong effect of this molecule on the amount of oxygen that is available for the tissues to breathe. And actually what this is saying is that a patient may well be breathing normally, but the oxygen is not released into the tissue or into the cells. And consequently, the patient is basically suffocating despite air being freely available. And actually, these are some recent papers on this phenomenon, a left shift in the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve in patients with severe corona disease. That's exactly this phenomenon that is happening. Phosphate is not mentioned in the paper. This one is a funny, interesting one. I shouldn't call it funny. The pathophysiology of happy hypoxemia in COVID-19. Many patients present with pronounced arterial hypoxemia, yet without proportional signals of respiratory distress. They not even verbalize a sense of dyspnea. I don't know how to pronounce that word, sorry. In other words, these people don't notice that they have a breathing problem, but still they're hypoxic. And that's exactly this mechanism here that I'm talking about. It's funny that they call it happy hypoxemia. I don't know if that's because of brain effects or because the people don't notice it, but it fits with this picture perfectly. Another effect of hypophosphatemia is that there's actually one muscle in the body, and it's funny that that muscle is very strongly affected. It's the diaphragm muscle, the one that pulls the lungs up and down in order to get air into the system. That's one of the first muscles to go when you have hypophosphatemia. This is a picture that I borrowed from Amanzadeh, where he looked at serum phosphate concentration and the maximum inspiratory pressure, basically with how much force can you pull air into your lung. And the moment that that becomes zero, yeah, basically you're not breathing anymore. And when it's -80, obviously you can pull air quite forcefully into your lung. And this, he didn't draw a line to this, which is a bit of a pity, but these black dots are normal phosphorus levels in the bloodstream. And you see that here, these people have the ability to pull air into the lung. But the moment that you become hypophosphatemic, basically that ability to pull air into your lung goes close to zero. These people cannot get air into the system anymore. And again, you all remember the run on breathing apparatus, etc. That is to compensate for these types of problems. And indeed, there's now more and more publications appearing that the diaphragm is indeed not functioning in the case of COVID patients. Okay. I won't go into a lot of detail on this picture, but on the right-hand side here, you see common symptoms, and this is just a random picture because there's all kinds of diagrams like this of problems that people with COVID develop, and which ultimately leads to them dying. And that can be the heart, it can be the lungs, it can be the brain, it can be the kidneys, it can be the liver. Basically, anything can go wrong in these patients. The one on the left here, and it's not an ideal picture, we actually looked at much more information to write our paper, is the symptoms of hypophosphatemia. You see here the brain here, you see the heart, you see muscle, but also the liver, the kidneys, and so on, all are very strongly affected by hypophosphatemia. And what is interesting is if you actually do a detailed study and you overlay the symptoms of hypophosphatemia with the symptoms of COVID, the secondary symptoms, there's actually a quite nice match between the two. That's why I put these P's in there. That's basically that same symptom can be explained with hypophosphatemia. Acute respiratory distress syndrome, for example, is a very common symptom in the case of hypophosphatemia. For magnesium, the picture is a little bit less clear. That's also why there's only a couple of magnesium ones in here, but there's certainly similarities here. But that's also why I focus my presentation a bit more on phosphorus. I think that is much more important. If Dr. Dijkstra would have been giving this presentation, she probably would have balanced it a little bit more than what I do. And yeah, this brings me to a little bit of a pun here. Is in my eyes, phosphate is the most underappreciated nutrient in human nutrition. And also in animal nutrition, it doesn't get a lot of attention. Yes, we've done 2 million phytase trials over the last 20 years to the point that you're getting annoyed by them, at least I am. But on the biology behind it, there's not a lot of work going on. And actually, when I talk to biochemists, I like to challenge them from, do you know of one biochemical mechanism in which phosphate doesn't play a role? And Jack probably can come up with one, but I haven't found one yet. I mean, phosphate is in the backbone of DNA. In bone, we keep talking calcium, but phosphate is all over the place. These pink dots are phospholipids on cell membranes. Energy metabolism, phosphate, activation of enzymes, phosphate, activation of some of the vitamins, phosphate, oxygen release from red blood cells, phosphate. It is all over the place. I mean, I cannot imagine anything that's more critical in the system than phosphate. Okay, so coming back to the role of vitamin D, we're not denying whatsoever that the vitamin D is not important as an immune modulator for COVID. I'm not qualified enough to answer about that. There's a lot of good science behind it that definitely can play a role. However, what we want to argue is that also the basic functions of vitamin D on mineral metabolism, reabsorption from the kidney, absorption from the intestinal tract, should be considered with respect to phosphate magnesium metabolism. Yeah, and then it gets tricky because I've talked about correlations. Causation is what we need, and that's, again, very hard to get that data. So in order to answer that, and actually I do have a slide on that later on, but in order to answer that, actually we looked at adjusted odds ratios. This is actually a paper from Mexico. Hernandez did a quite nice study, used a large population of people, I think 14,000. And basically what he did is calculated what are the odds for getting serious COVID complications depending on various factors. The other thing that this paper did is actually included quite a lot of factors in there, while a lot of people papers had much less of them. And the data that Hernandez presents fit reasonably well with what other papers find. So some of the things that he sees there: men more prone to COVID than women. Older age, over 53, higher odds. Smoking, protective. And I'll come back to that later, so don't start smoking yet. Obesity, very negative effects. Pneumonia, very surprising in my mind, because you have damaged lungs, you have all kinds of health challenges in the lungs, but it's actually not that big of a risk factor. Diabetes, big risk. Hypertension, diuretics, all big risks. What we did is we actually looked for these conditions. Can we explain a higher odds ratio with these conditions or lower odds ratio based on phosphate or magnesium metabolism? Again, correlation, not causation. I've really realized that. Well, let's start with age. This is a beautiful graph. I really love this one. Chiachi 2008, the effect of age on phosphate levels in a subject. Black line are men, drops very nicely with age, fits perfectly with what we see in COVID. And hey, women, the moment around menopause, I don't know if menopause is the causal factor, they actually deviate from what men do. Okay, this fits beautifully with what is happening with COVID. Magnesium, there's also an age effect. Unfortunately, it's very hard to find good data out there. Babagala probably has done most work in this area. This graph is from him, and also this graph is from him, but I would not be surprised if it actually is exactly the same data, just presented in a different way. Good p-value, decent correlation. There's also an age effect on magnesium levels. Obesity, magnesium, very nice graph, good R value, nice p-value. Magnesium drops quite strongly with a degree of obesity. For phosphate, frankly, this is the ugliest graph that I could find to put in here. I couldn't find anything better. The p-value is nice, the R value is not impressive, but it actually is generally accepted that with obesity, phosphate levels goes down. And actually, if you go in the textbook, you can find diagrams like this one here, where it's explained nicely that various hormones, various factors have an effect of phosphate reabsorption in the kidneys. So when you are obese, phosphate levels go down in people as well. Diabetes, I'll only show one picture because it's very convincing. The percentage of people deficient in magnesium and phosphate, healthy versus diabetes. And again, there's many papers that have shown this. Deficiencies of magnesium and phosphate are rampant in people with diabetes. And that's because insulin is actually a master regulator in this whole metabolic cascade, in ATP metabolism, but also in the functioning of the kidney, etc. Okay. And actually, this is, again, a little bit of a pun, but I got an email over the weekend from the most read papers for the American Journal of Physiology from 2020. This paper from Muniapi was in the top 5, COVID-19 pandemic, coronavirus, and diabetes mellitus. Very nice story, but he doesn't mention magnesium or phosphate once in the whole picture. So frustrating in my eyes. Okay. It's actually, when you dive deeper into magnesium and phosphate, an interesting paper from Gomez, who talks about hypomagnesemia in type 2 diabetes, a vicious cycle. And basically what he is saying is that actually when you have problems with magnesium, you can induce a diabetic state. First of all, magnesium is involved in the production and the release of insulin in the pancreatic beta cells, but also magnesium plays a very serious role in the action of insulin in various tissues. So when you have no magnesium there, you won't get insulin being secreted. And if it is secreted at all, then it won't have any actions in the cells where we need the action. So I dubbed the triple-edged sword, which is not really a word, but hey, you get the pun, I think. The interesting thing is that I didn't look very hard, but I don't know if there's papers like this on phosphate, but I bet if you dive into the mechanisms in the pancreas on phosphate, you're going to find exactly the same thing. And in the tissues itself, if you look at the insulin receptor cascade, phosphate, 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 it is all over the place. So you're probably going to have exactly the same situation there as well. Another data set from Barbagallo, actually, this is the same data that I was showing before on the effect of age, but this is on hypertension and type 2 diabetes. So we see that in those situations, again, magnesium levels are seriously decreased as a consequence. And another data set, Wu, he categorized people based on phosphate and magnesium levels. Nice relationship in both situations as well. And a paper from Zhang, and it's a bit of a complicated graph, but also showing a nice relationship between magnesium and blood pressure. And actually the reason for that, and I didn't dive into this in a lot of detail, is it's likely kidney functioning where the reabsorption of magnesium and phosphate is impaired when you have a high blood pressure. Diuretics, and here I have to make a differentiation because there's a whole range of them. Again, I have to be careful here because I'm definitely not an expert, but the two that are getting most of the attention in the case of COVID are the loop diuretics and the thiazides. These actually work at the region of the kidney where the magnesium and phosphate are reabsorbed. So, and they inhibit the reabsorption of those, both of those minerals. This is a nice picture from George looking at hypomagnesemia in those two diuretics. And you see 100%, 72% of the people are deficient when taking those diuretics. So again, there we can make a nice correlation, not causation. Okay. Now the ones that were surprising, pneumonia. And here it gets a bit trickier. And again, here, Dr. Dijkstra had fantastic insight, and she explained to me that Legionella as a cause of pneumonia actually causes hypophosphatemia. However, when pneumonia is associated with kidney problems, which apparently happens quite a bit, you end up with hyperphosphatemia. And this picture from NAFA, who's looking at phosphorus and pneumonia and mortality, actually is a very interesting one. Because indeed he's showing, and I think these symbols, by the way, are the wrong way around, but that may just be me. He's showing that when you have hypophosphatemia and pneumonia, you're in bad shape, your chance of mortality go up quite drastically. But also when you have hyperphosphatemia, your chances of mortality go up quite drastically. So there's definitely a role there for phosphate as well. But coming back to COVID, the interesting thing is the number of subjects in each of these categories. Hyperphosphatemia, 443 patients, hypophosphatemia, only 62. There's a factor 7 difference between the two. So if you go back to our story of phosphate, magnesium, and pneumonia, then it looks like pneumonia very much leans to hyperphosphatemia, so that could explain somewhat of a protective role there. Smoking, and here I have to be very careful, it is controversial. And there's also people that report higher odds ratio with smoking, although several of them do report lower odds ratios. So don't use this as an excuse to start smoking just to combat COVID. That definitely isn't the idea. I see some people smiling, fortunately. This is a paper from Hussein 2015, duration of smoking in years versus serum phosphate level. And you see a nice increase here with smoking. Another study out of the Middle East, Husseini, he exposed mitochondria to cigarette smoking extract, and then you can start wondering from how physiological is this. But what he is showing actually is that mitochondrial numbers and ATP levels go down. And that's actually interesting for the story that we have. Well, if the mitochondria go down and the ATP content go down, then you cannot upshift very much. And that's also why you don't see heavy duty smokers being marathon runners or successful marathon runners, I should say that. There's a downshift in metabolism, so that actually fits nicely together. Okay. Season, and there we don't know enough yet, but coming back to vitamin D, we know that sunlight is responsible for the production of vitamin D in the skin, and this is a nice study. It's actually from the southern hemisphere, so I cut off the months to not confuse people too much. But when sunlight goes up in springtime, you see that vitamin D follows very nicely. And actually, there's a delay in there because vitamin D has a very long half-life, but there's a very nice seasonal pattern. This is a study from the northern hemisphere, Japan, where they looked at phosphate levels, and you see exactly the same profile happening. And for magnesium, there's data as well. It's too early to tell, and it's very dangerous what I'm doing here. But when we had springtime this year and COVID was hitting the US, was hitting the Netherlands, we thought we had a big mess. And these are the blips that we had at that point. We had certainly problems, but not as bad as the mess that we're in right now. Australia and New Zealand, right now they're having a party because they're really not suffering from COVID. That may well change. They claim that it's fantastic biosecurity, and second, they're living on an island with a population density that is insignificant compared to a lot of other places. So there's a lot of other factors in their benefit. I cannot say because it's a very complicated picture if season is playing a role in there, but it's a very interesting one to think about how it fits in the total picture. Okay. So yeah, coming back to getting information from Facebook, anecdotal information, I realized that. And again, the challenge that we have is where do we get the good quality information to build our case, to come up with a compelling story. That's where we would have to get blood samples. And we're not in a position to do that. We did find some studies, and actually there's more and more studies coming out. And I'm making a very big marketing argument here because I have 8 studies here and I'm putting them all together on one slide. I should have made 8 slides with 8 pictures. That way at the end you would have been impressed, and now you probably go from but actually several of these studies are not that robust. Xu, he actually compared severe COVID and not severe COVID, but people who still had COVID. So this 1.1 is borderline phosphate, 0.79 is deficient, no question about it. Interestingly, Xu measured a range of parameters in his patients, and there was one single one that correlated with severity of damage from COVID, that was phosphate. Okay. Arenas, healthy people, 1.45, very nice level. People with COVID, 0.75, severely deficient. Yavdani is this picture here. She actually categorized patients based on the CORAD scheme, which is an official reporting system for corona damage, COVID damage. And you see here, there's a nice relationship there between severe and moderate corona. What is interesting and at the same time frustrating, and I didn't highlight this for people that were paying close attention to the graph, is when phosphate are reported, the data are frankly confusing. In my mind, phosphate PO4, molecular weight 94, you should be able to do the math quite easy, but actually data sets don't always line up. And that's because some people report P, some people and call it phosphate, some report phosphate. It's actually a big mess. If I take these values as being phosphate, then actually, if you take a level of 4, and these people are actually lower, you can translate that to 0.4 millimoles of phosphate in a severe patient. Well, that is extremely deficient, but even those patients would be highly deficient because they're about 0.5 millimoles, so actually lower than the values that are reported here. The big question is, does she mean P or does she mean phosphate when she writes phosphate here? And that is something I don't know. Yavdani also measured a range of parameters in a patient, and again, only phosphate was predictive of the severity of infection, which is again a very interesting sign. Varian, 56% of corona patients have hypophosphatemia, didn't categorize for severity of infection. Kunat, 65%, again, no categorization. Werner didn't measure phosphate, unfortunately, but at admission he measured magnesium and creatinine and a range of other parameters. The creatinine, by the way, is highly linked to phosphate metabolism because it's phosphocreatine that's broken down to form creatinine, which is then excreted in the urine. Those two parameters were predictive of survival. None of the other ones were. Young, this one came out very recently. Hypophosphatemia has an adjusted odds ratio of 15. That's a lot higher than anything else that I was reporting before. And he talks, from all the parameters he measures, he talks about two in his conclusions, phosphate and calcium. Phosphate had the biggest specificity for severity. Don't ask me what that means exactly, 98.5, but that's a mighty high value. So again, confirming what other people found. Boot, actually, these are not COVID data, but SARS data. So this paper is, 17, 18 years old by now. It's from Toronto when SARS hit quite heavily there. 57% of the people had hypomagnesemia, 75% had hypophosphatemia. Boot is one of the groups that we contacted asking, can you please measure it? And actually the group, they are still active in the same domain. They responded very positively, but as of today, we have seen nothing coming back from them. That means they're either writing a paper and trying to have a big breakthrough, or they don't have the data, or they have data to prove the opposite and don't want to tell us. I don't know, but it's interesting that nobody is responding back and providing us with feedback. One more study, this is actually a supplementation study. Unfortunately, relatively small. Unfortunately, no phosphate in there, but the data are actually amazing. This is a supplementation with vitamin D3, magnesium, and vitamin B12. The levels used are not impressive. It's a study in Asia. People tend to be a bit smaller there, at least than what I am. So you need to put that in perspective. But if you look at the outcome, this is the percentage of patients that require oxygen therapy. We're going from over 60 to under 20. That's a factor 3.5 different. Intensive care treatment, that's a factor 5 different. If we could repeat that on a global scale, we could probably downgrade COVID to a nasty flu. Okay, there's something to think about that. So that brings me to the conclusions. And I see that I've talked a little bit faster than I should have. But we have a lot of fancy tools in science, and it's amazing what people can do with cytokines, with gene sequencing, etc. I mean, fantastic. But we shouldn't ignore the basics of what is going on in the system. And phosphate and magnesium are very critical in energy metabolism. I don't know, Jack, in the meantime, if you thought up of a biochemical mechanism that doesn't involve phosphate, but I'm curious to hear about it. There's plenty of evidence that the conditions that predispose people to severe COVID have problems with phosphate and magnesium. Yes, that's anecdotal, but still intriguing. And in the studies where magnesium and phosphate have been measured, and yes, it's not a lot of them, but magnesium and phosphate in all cases were deficient. And where they assessed correlation with severity, they were always the winners in those studies, making it very interesting. Last but not least, the COVID complications do match phosphate and magnesium deficiencies. So the plea that we're making in our paper is not to draw a conclusion, but for people to start monitoring this in hospital. I mean, it's one extra check mark at a form when you go into the hospital. When there is a deficiency, please correct it when they occur. And also we're going a step further is when when you are a risk category, please take a vitamin D supplement and maybe even start taking magnesium and phosphate supplement. The risk of doing so is very, very low. And hopefully the benefits are much larger than any risk that you have. Actually, just around Christmas, there was a letter written by a large group of scientists to all the governments around the world, urging them to suggest vitamin D supplementation to the population. A couple countries, I think the UK has taken this advice and is using it, at least in some reasons, but most governments still are very conservative and not taking that action. And frankly, it's very disappointing, especially with vitamin D. The risk that we're taking is extremely low. And if the benefits are like we see here, boy, it would be very, very big impact. So with that, the end of my presentation, and if there's any questions related to this topic, I'd be very happy to answer them. I'm not a COVID expert, by the way, so there I have to be careful.
Well, great. Yeah, thank you very much for sharing that with us. I'll remind everyone, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat or raise your hand if you want to ask that in person. We do have one question coming through already, Dr. Van Kempen. Are there studies on the best natural foods to eat to improve phosphate levels to healthy concentrations? This question is more on the actual effect of the food on the person, not the food phosphorus content per se. That may factor in bioavailability, excretion, and so forth.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. We didn't dive into that. On the animal side, on the animal science side, for phosphorus, we have all kinds of databases showing bioavailable phosphorus in foodstuffs. So the plant sources of phosphorus are not that great as a phosphate source because the digestibility is very poor. Basically, to play it safe, you have to use animal products. Then you get the best load of phosphate. With magnesium, frankly, I would have to look into it. With magnesium in livestock nutrition, at least in pigs, there's plenty of magnesium in the diet, and nobody really worries about it. So there we don't have all that detail, but there's also going to be differences there. But there I cannot give you a straight answer. We'd have to look into that.
Okay, Brooke, I see that you have your hand raised.
Thanks, Ben. My question was kind of related to the struggles of getting that data that you mentioned. I know we all know how reliable social media and the news is, but they've definitely kind of hinted at, especially beginning, issues with reporting deaths as COVID or not as COVID. And when you show that slide about how many conditions are overlapped with the phosphorus deficiencies, what sort of data are you getting back from hospitals in terms of linking death and those specific secondary symptoms, and how is that related, or how is that data getting processed?
No, there are no data. So literally there's nobody so far that has provided us with data, despite pleas, and we've contacted government agencies, hospitals all over the world. Literally, we have gotten zero data whatsoever.
How are they marking the COVID cases as severe versus not severe and getting that data? Is that linked to specific symptoms that,
yeah,
your category?
Yeah, there is that CORADS scheme that I was showing a couple of slides back. So there's a formal categorization scheme for COVID patients. And I probably have it written down somewhere, but I don't have it in my head. But when you're intensive care, then you're probably a 3 or 4. When you're not in intensive care, just in the hospital, you're probably a 2 or 3. And when you're able to stay at home, you're probably a 1. But don't quote me on that, but it's probably something like that.
Thank you.
Yeah. But
Okay, we have
that's
a question on rural communities are historically underserved and medical resources are limited. So in these communities, are there higher rates of obesity, diabetes, and these other conditions that are leading to poor health outcomes?
Yeah, that's a very generic question, and there's certainly populations where obesity is a very serious challenge. But to generalize that is very difficult. I mean, if you look in Asia and you go to the poor neighborhoods, people are darn skinny because they don't have food. If you go to the US, to some areas, because they eat a lot of starch foods, you have serious obesity. So I cannot generalize into that. And again, we were very much focused on biochemical mechanisms, trying to tie things together. We didn't dive into population studies or anything like that. You have to keep in mind that Dr. Dijksler is retired. And I have a full-time job that costs me 60, 70 hours a week. This was a evening project, literally. So we focused on the literature, and there's only so much you can do. We did a lot of contacting, and again, it was, for example, I contacted the Dutch Health Authority. I thought that would be an easy one, and they called me back, yeah, vitamin D is on our radar. Well, hold on a minute. I'm saying you need to look beyond vitamin D in my mail. They didn't even read it. And
Kristen, did you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, so that was actually a statement that those are actual issues in these rural communities. So my question is how can we translate the knowledge that you've presented to actually address these through preventative nutritional strategies and to improve like medical response within these communities? Because that's been a major issue that I've been seeing.
Well, my advice is that everybody takes vitamin D, and especially the risk factor, the risk categories definitely take vitamin D. And actually, a lot of people also, it's worthwhile to take magnesium supplements in people. And that's also, if you go back to that letter that I mentioned, the advice there is 4,000 units. And some people may cringe at that and go from, whoa, this is dangerous. But this is from a large group of people, and probably even 1,000 units is fine. But start taking vitamin D. Magnesium, bit trickier, but still there's not a whole lot of risk with overdosing. Phosphate is difficult. You cannot go to the supermarket, at least I don't think so, to buy phosphate pills. At least I'm not aware of supplements. So there, my advice to people is drink an extra glass of milk or an extra egg or an extra steak or something like that with your dinner to make sure that you get enough phosphorus in your diet.
Hey, Dr.
And even jump in here, but soft drinks, right?
Yeah, Coca-Cola, but there you have a large load of sugar.
You can modulate that, but those have a lot of phosphorus there. So
yeah, I had that in my advice, but Dr. Dijksler told me to take it out.
Take it out, yeah, okay. But thinking about those rural communities again, for phosphorus, that's a source, they're probably getting.
Yeah. There, what I don't know is what the risk of hyperphosphatemia is, because that is a risk. Although with phosphorus you can go quite high before you get into trouble. Yeah. With magnesium, that risk is not that big. With phosphorus, that you may have more of a risk there. So, but the vitamin D, 4,000 units, provided don't have strange abnormalities, shouldn't cause a problem. And Jack, you've seen my Christmas letter. The advice to all my friends and family was, please start taking vitamin D. And to date, everybody that has listened to that advice has not gotten serious COVID that I'm aware of. So, but that's a bad experiment.
All right, let's go to Dr. Furquette. You had a question?
Well, Jack sort of stole my thunder a little bit, but Theo, I teach a vitamin metabolism course and a mineral metabolism course since last fall. COVID was one of our subjects of study in vitamin metabolism. We had a couple students that worked on this and identified several vitamins, including vitamin D. And I'm getting ready for a mineral metabolism class. So my question is, would you be willing to do a guest lecture on this?
Happy to.
Secondly, I'm really intrigued by this because these two minerals are involved with a lot of inflammatory type problems, gut health issues, and we battle with that. And my concern is, with animals, we threw in phytase and all these other things, but we're not really providing the body phosphate which is a very important buffering and used in a lot of other things. Other than trying to find a supplement, I mean, I was going to suggest, wow, you can just have a Pepsi and a little bit of magnesium chloride in there, and to solve these things. But could you, as you were given this presentation, there are a lot of vitamins other than vitamin D that are influenced by these two, that influence the metabolism of these two minerals. And so could you think about some of those vitamins? You mentioned one, like the creatine phosphate. It's not really a vitamin, but
vitamin K2 is one. And that's actually, again, the first slide that I showed all kinds of nutrients that are implicated in COVID. I mean, one of my favorites is quercetin, which is a plant extract. Several of you may know that's deemed a strong antioxidant. Sorry. Well, you type in COVID and quercetin, and you find all kinds of papers saying that quercetin cures COVID. There's so much literature coming out on COVID, so many hypotheses that it's impossible to see the forest through the trees, basically. And that's exactly the problem that we were facing, is we were one of those trees. So that's the tricky part. I actually attended a lecture a couple of weeks ago. Very interesting. Was a British group. They had characterized that COVID receptor that binds to that ACE protein, and they found the linoleic acid binding protein. Pocket, in there. And then they subsequently did a trial to show if you had linoleic acid to corona, it actually inhibited the corona binding to that receptor. So there's a lot of fun things that you can do. Peter, your point is perfectly right. The picture is much bigger than this, and we need to make sure that nutrition is complete. The challenge is if you're telling a story and you say, I need this and I need this and I need that, people stop listening. So that's why we chose to focus. I had vitamin K2 in here. I very strongly believe that if you take vitamin D2, tip for everybody in the audience, you should also consume vitamin K2 at the same time. Don't disconnect the two. But again, hey, I have a co-author. She said we didn't make a good case for that, so I shouldn't present that. And again, that's the compromise that you have to take.
Yeah, usually when I'm talking to medical doctors about nutrition or veterinarians, their eyes glaze over. And so that's one of our things that our nutrition curriculum could really help with, is trying to train future doctors that they really need to think about nutrition and metabolism in the long run, if we're really going to solve some of these serious problems. Well, thank you, Theo.
Welcome.
All right. Do you have any idea what may happen with magnesium and phosphate depletion on asymptomatic patients?
Sorry, so asymptomatic patients, according to our story, don't have serious phosphate and magnesium problems. Okay, I'm generalizing a little bit. But to get to a stage 3, 4, 5 COVID patients, we feel that phosphorus and magnesium is playing a big role in that. And that's also, if you look at the data from Tan, the last one I showed, is that the moment he did the supplementation, problems went away quite extensively. I mean, a factor 5 difference in intensive care unit treatment. I mean, in animal science, we're happy to get a 5% difference from a treatment. You know, a factor 5, that's 500%. That's impressive. Small study.
What about calcium phosphate supplements?
Yeah, the tricky part is that if you have too much calcium relative to phosphate, you actually can cause all kinds of precipitations, etc. And the calcium metabolism is regulated very different than phosphorus metabolism. One comment that Peter made is on phosphorus metabolism in general, that we don't dive into that deep enough. I mean, in stress responses, you see that phosphorus and magnesium do very strange things, while calcium doesn't. I don't, and again, you cannot state that black and white, but the need for phosphorus in those stress conditions is much higher than for phosphate. Sorry, the need for phosphate is much higher than for calcium.
Okay. You mentioned Legionella pneumonia. Mm-hmm. Is there a mechanism why this specifically leads to hypophosphatemia? And is this different than the traditional pneumonia?
No, this goes beyond my knowledge. So that I would have to ask Dr. Dijksler. I have to say that working with a very qualified medical doctor was fun. So because I mean, it's a very nice synergy. I mean, she brought things to the table that I would have never been able to come up with, and the other way around. So it was a very nice collaboration, and I have some of the same reservations for medical doctors that Peter has. Don't get me wrong, but at the same time, to think about such collaboration, you can do amazing things together. So the previous paper that we wrote, by the way, was on sudden infant death syndrome. It had to do with that oxygen release from the red blood cells. We think that's the mechanism behind sudden infant death syndrome. Okay. By the way, the same frustration, we can explain every symptom of sudden infant death syndrome and nobody listens, even though it's published. And it's a key mortality in infants. But yeah, sorry, I'm deviating.
All right. Would having an excess of phosphate and magnesium in your system have the reverse effect? Meaning, do you think patients would be more likely to contract COVID, or would the infection be more severe with hyper?
With anything, you don't want to go overboard. With phosphate, I mean, once you get over 4 millimole, that's the textbook figure, then you start having issues. So there's actually quite a lot of leeway, and also the body is quite good at regulating phosphates. I mean, the absorption in the intestines is regulated, excretion in the kidney is regulated. So I wouldn't be immediately worried that if you have a too high phosphate diet, I mean, if you drink a bottle of Coke every single day, that causes problems, unless there's something else going wrong. With magnesium, if you have overdoses, you get diarrhea problems and so on. So that's not fun. But metabolically, again, there's absorption mechanisms. But that's something that Jerry Spears would be much more qualified to answer than me.
All right. Unfortunately, we have run out of time for this lecture series. So thank everybody for joining, and thank you, Dr. Van Kempen. Of course, if you have further questions, we may be able to get those answered in writing next week. We don't have a seminar scheduled, so please make sure to join us in 2 weeks as we look at a presentation on unraveling botanical mixtures via untargeted metabolomics by Dr. Josh Kellogg of Penn State University. We're looking forward to that.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to say thanks, Theo. You did an outstanding job as usual. It's like drinking from a fire hydrant. I think when you get going. And
sorry.
This is right down your alley. You're showing your true colors, your ability to integrate information and then just draw, correlative associations. It's masterful. So really, really well done. And realize we're running out of time. People are bailing off, but if I can, Susie, I'll just, before you close it out.
Yeah.
I was intrigued by the energy demand of this, thinking about the cytokine storm, which if you're tracking sort of like the infection and then what's transpiring, and try to think in a progressive way about the disease manifestation. I wonder about the energy status of the immune cells, right? Your innate immune cells, the adaptive cells that are being drawn upon to create these storms. What's their energy supply and status? Do you see lactic? I mean, if there truly was poor oxygen delivery, you'd expect maybe lactic acid or some other biomarkers to give you some insight as to what level that's happening. It could be happening, just within immune cells and not really impacting the person on a larger level. I mean, the effect on those immune systems could affect the individual, but I'm saying from an energy balance or an energy supply standpoint, it really might relate to what those immune cells are able to do. Don't know, just thinking out loud.
Yep. No, and again, it's fascinating to think what we could do as nutritionists to support the body under those conditions. Yeah. But did you find a biochemical pathway in which
I didn't. Everything's enclosed in membranes, so even if it's not in the pathway itself, it's probably happening in a subcellular compartment somewhere, right? So you got me.
If Jack doesn't know it.
Well, we do thank you for your time, and I'm happy to, if you want to chat some more, to leave this going. But
I actually have my family waiting for dinner here. It's a
I have to say, I know it's late there, and we really appreciate you coming and meeting with us. So
no, again, I enjoyed it. So appreciate the invite. It's nice to
Good
be
to
back.
see you, Theo.
virtually. Yep. Thanks.
Good to see you.
Yeah, here's your fellow Dutchman.
Not anymore. He doesn't count anymore. He
I
left the
still
country
speak
too
some
long.
Dutch.
Yeah, I know very well. Yeah,
Nice
better
job,
than
though.
most
That was
Thanks.
fantastic.
thank you
Appreciate
all.
it.
Susie, I see that you have it recording,
Mhm.
right? It's recorded. So could a link be made available? I have a former student